Can you end up in the wrong place at the wrong time, purely by chance? Can such a situation lead to a tragic outcome? Or is our fate already written in the heavens, beyond our power to change? When Nancy swapped shifts with a colleague at the restaurant, she didn't know she was signing her own death warrant. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. It was 1967 when Eldwin Lovelady and Janet Stupp met at the Clover Drive-In Theater in Fort Worth, Texas. Eldwin, or Eddie as his friends called him, was born in Louisiana. He was an Air Force mechanic and served in Vietnam. Janet grew up in Fort Worth with her 4 sisters. The girl's family was in dire financial straits, and when she was just 14, her mother pushed her to marry a neighbor. Janet dropped out of school and, at 15, gave birth to her first child, Rito. Motherhood was an overwhelming burden for a teenager, so ultimately, her mother raised the girl. Janet dropped out of school, divorced her husband, and got a job. At 18, the young woman went to a drive-in theater where she happened to notice the most handsome man she had ever seen. Eddie and Janet fell madly in love, got married, and moved to Spokane, Washington. On March 4, 1968, the couple welcomed a beautiful little girl, Nancy. Just 14 months after her birth, she gained a younger brother, Eddie, named after his father. Raising 2 children was tough for Janet, especially since her husband was constantly away on duty. At the time, he was in Japan, and rumors increasingly reached the young wife that Eddie had found a girlfriend to keep him company in another country. Janet acted like a child. Instead of confronting her husband, she decided to leave everything behind, including her husband and 2 children. Ed felt betrayed and filed for divorce, then took 4-year-old Nancy and 3-year-old Eddie to Japan. Nancy's childhood was spent in various cities because the family moved frequently. Eventually, her father settled in Mountain Home, Idaho, remarried, and had 3 more children. Meanwhile, Nancy's mother, Janet, managed to remarry and divorce again. Despite her mother's long absence, Nancy was forgiving about her return. Regardless of distance and time, she loved her mother more than anything in the world and believed she deserved a second chance to be a good parent. In 1983, Nancy moved with Janet to the small Texas town of Graham, with a population of about 8,500. Nancy's grandparents lived there. The girl grew very close to her mother, and they were often mistaken for sisters because they did everything together. To help her mother pay the bills, Nancy first took a job as a waitress, then a second job at a pizzeria. In high school, she worked, studied, and participated in several beauty pageants. She was a vibrant blonde with a radiant smile, beautiful not only on the outside, but also on the inside. People who knew Nancy said she was cheerful and outgoing, had many friends, and easily made new ones. She could spend hours on the phone chatting with her girlfriends or disappear until late in the evening, roller skating, bowling, or walking in nature. In winter, she loved skiing and ice fishing. Nancy was in her senior year of high school when, in mid-February, she met the man of her dreams. His name was Anthony Todd Depriest, and he was a few years older. Todd worked on a ranch and dreamed of joining the U.S. Air Force. Returning home after that fateful meeting, Nancy excitedly told her mother she had met a young man she wanted to marry. Of course, Janet wasn't thrilled. Her daughter strongly reminded her of her own youth and her first failed marriage. She didn't want Nancy to repeat her mistakes. The woman hoped her daughter would finish high school and attend college before starting a family. But Nancy was resolute in this matter. If she wanted something, she simply did it. The girl fell deeply in love with Todd, and on her birthday, March 4th, she moved in with him in Grand Bay. On May 1st, 1986, they got married. Nancy graduated high school as a married woman. Janet, her mother, tried her best to accept the new circumstances, realizing that the only way to maintain a relationship with her daughter was to learn to love her man, Todd, and allow Nancy to make her own decisions. Soon, Nancy learned she was pregnant with a girl. At that moment, she felt completely happy, because her daughter became the missing link in their young family. Nancy dreamed of being the most loving and caring mother. Her husband, Todd, also fulfilled his dream. He joined the Air Force and, by December, landed a job as an aircraft maintenance specialist. In 1986, the Depriest couple moved to Austin, Texas, where Todd worked at a military base and Nancy got a job at a Pizza Hut, quickly climbing the career ladder. Coming from a small town, the young woman fell in love with the hustle and bustle of the big city, but she fell even more in love with the Pizza Hut community. At the time, the chain was quite popular. Employees sometimes worked at different locations, covered for each other, and organized softball tournaments. Over 2 years, Nancy worked at 3 different locations and wholeheartedly loved the Pizza Hut team. In July 1987, in the midst of Austin's humid, sticky heat, little Sylvia Depriest was born. The girl came into the world with a thick head of dark hair, like her father's, making her young parents the happiest people alive. Sylvia had just been born, and Nancy was already dreaming of when she'd grow up enough to buy her a little toy car. In April 1988, Nancy started working at the Pizza Hut on Rainey Street as an assistant manager. The young mother showed her colleagues family photos, saying that Todd and Sylvia were the greatest joy in her life. All the employees knew how much Nancy loved her family, and deep down, they were a little jealous. At the same time, she was an excellent leader, responsible, moderately strict, and always ready to help. In October 1988, Nancy was 20 years old, and her little daughter was just over a year old. The young mother spent the first half of the day with baby Sylvia and worked at the pizzeria in the evenings. Additionally, Nancy was one of the most dedicated players on the Pizza Hut softball team. It wasn't that she loved sports so much. The young woman simply enjoyed being involved in her company's life and socializing with different people at events. On Monday, October 24th, Nancy Depriest was scheduled to work the second shift as usual, but that evening, the company had planned another softball game, so Nancy swapped shifts with another manager and arranged for a babysitter to watch Sylvia. In the morning, Nancy put her daughter in a car seat and drove to work. Her husband, Todd, followed them on his motorcycle since the couple only had one car and had to coordinate with each other. At 7 a.m., the woman started her shift at the pizzeria, and her husband took the wheel of the car to drop Sylvia off at the babysitter's. Around 7:40 a.m., he returned to the Pizza Hut, knocked on the service exit door, handed the car keys to his wife, and kissed her goodbye. He then rode his motorcycle toward the Air Force base. He didn't yet know that he had seen Nancy alive for the last time. The restaurant opened for customers at 11 a.m., but the manager needed to prepare in the morning, check supplies, and set the dough for pizzas. When Nancy was alone in the restaurant, she usually locked all the doors, but that morning was different. The general manager of the Pizza Hut chain couldn't reach his employee for an hour, calling from 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. It was almost opening time, but no one answered at the restaurant. This was strange because Nancy always took her job very seriously. Perhaps she forgot she had swapped shifts. The manager decided to go to the restaurant and check the situation in person. He was immediately surprised that the service exit was unlocked. This meant Nancy had made it to the pizzeria, but apparently forgot to lock up. Surveying the dining area, the manager noticed the restaurant floor was covered in water. Apparently, a faucet had broken, or a pipe had burst. He called out to Nancy but got no response. He could hear the dough mixing machine running in the kitchen, but the employee wasn't there. It seemed the water was coming from the men's restroom. The manager realized why Nancy wasn't answering. She was probably fixing the leak. Opening the restroom door, the man was met with a horrifying sight. Barely holding back a scream, he rushed out of the building and immediately called emergency services. While waiting for the police and ambulance, the gruesome scene still flashed before his eyes. Nancy Depriest's light hair was stained red, and a pool of blood under her head mixed with the water. The young woman was naked, but what shocked the manager most was her lifeless gaze, staring into the void. The police who arrived at the scene went straight to the men's restroom, as directed by the manager. On the floor under the sink, they indeed found the girl. She had presumably suffered a gunshot wound to the head. When one of the officers approached the victim, he noticed she was still breathing. The policeman spoke to her, trying to bring her to consciousness, but unfortunately she couldn't respond as she began to choke. At that moment, the ambulance arrived, and the girl was placed on a stretcher and rushed to the hospital, where she underwent emergency surgery and was connected to a life support machine. Her condition was critical, with little chance of survival, but the doctors continued to fight for her life. Meanwhile, investigators from the Austin Police Department were called to the Pizza Hut. The restaurant was closed to customers. The detectives first determined the cause of the flooding. It turned out that a blue apron had been stuffed into the sink's drain, and water from the faucet was spilling onto the floor. This was clearly the perpetrator's attempt to wash away evidence. On the floor near the toilet lay khaki pants, a piece of light blue underwear, and a trash can lid. Nearby was a white button-up dress shirt with bloodstains. It appeared to be Nancy Depriest's clothing. The perpetrator had tied the woman's hands behind her back with her bra. Despite attempts to remove evidence, the criminal left behind one .22 caliber shell casing. All physical evidence was collected and sent to the forensic laboratory for analysis. Certain aspects of the crime suggested the perpetrator was a man. Since Nancy was naked, the investigators assumed she had likely been assaulted. There were no signs of a break-in. This raised a legitimate question. Did the restaurant employee open the door herself, or did the perpetrator have a key? In the dining area, the detectives found a hair without a root. This made it very difficult to identify whom it belonged to, but it was still evidence. In 1988, Austin experienced a series of robberies targeting Pizza Hut restaurants, as people mostly paid in cash at the time. During 4 robberies that occurred in the late evening or early morning, no one was harmed, so a connection to the prior crimes was unlikely. Still, the investigators checked the cash register and the safe in the back office just in case. Based on the receipts, it turned out that the previous day's revenue was missing. All this time, the detectives hoped that Nancy Depriest, the victim and witness to the crime, would survive and be able to tell them what happened and identify the robber. But, unfortunately, that was not to be. After surgery, Nancy was connected to life support and remained in a coma. Her body clung to life with its last strength, but the doctor's prognosis was grim. The young woman held on for only a few hours. The doctors allowed her relatives to say goodbye before disconnecting her from the machine. Depriest's death weighed heavily on the hearts of her loved ones. Her husband, Todd, was left alone with his grief. They had a little girl, Sylvia, and taking her mother away from such a young child was inhumane. Nancy's mother, Janet, had a complete breakdown. She simply couldn't believe her daughter had fallen victim to robbers. The woman cried, screamed that it was impossible, but deep down, she knew Nancy wouldn't have wanted to exist in such a state. When the doctors confirmed that the girl had irreversible injuries and her condition was sustained only by the machine, the relatives made the hardest decision of their lives. Yet, even in this dire situation, Nancy Depriest was able to help others. Her heart, liver, kidneys, and bone marrow extended someone else's life, as the deceased woman became an organ donor for those in need of transplants. The forensic medical examination confirmed the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head. Nancy had an entry wound just above her left ear. Her hair in that area had been cut. There were no stippling marks on the wound, indicating the shot was fired from a distance. The bullet passed through the skull from the back and lodged in the orbitofrontal cortex of the brain. The .22 caliber mushroom-shaped lead bullet was extracted and preserved as evidence. The coroner also noted that the woman had been assaulted by the perpetrator. DNA extracted from the perpetrator's semen was added to the case file. But at the time, it was essentially useless, as criminals were typically identified by blood type. Thus, the investigation of the pizzeria robbery turned into an investigation of the murder of Nancy Depriest. The detectives first considered the theory that the victim knew her attacker and had let the perpetrator inside herself. Whether it was a colleague, friend, relative, or just an acquaintance remained to be determined, and the police got to work. Naturally, they first checked Nancy's husband, Todd, but the man had a solid alibi. That morning, he was at the military base, where dozens of people saw him. The detective leading the case of the attack on the Pizza Hut employee calculated the approximate time of the crime. At 7 a.m., Nancy arrived at work. At 7:40 a.m., her husband Todd brought her the car keys. Around 8:30 a.m., Depriest called a supply company to order products for the restaurant, and around 10 a.m., the general manager found Nancy on the men's restroom floor. Thus, the crime occurred between 8:30 and 10 a.m. The Depriest case made headlines in Texas newspapers and was reported on radio and television news programs. The public was frightened and put pressure on law enforcement, demanding that the case be solved quickly and the criminal be put behind bars. The problem was that in 1988, Austin saw over 40 different crimes resulting in fatalities, all requiring immediate investigation. The homicide department had only 6 detectives, who physically couldn't keep up with conducting all procedures thoroughly, and they could be called to a new crime scene at any time of day or night. Sometimes they worked 24 hours a day without sleep or rest. Like anyone, many officers experienced professional burnout, their goal being to close each case as quickly as possible due to pressure from authorities and the public. Victims' families called the police station daily, asking for updates on their cases. The lead detective on Nancy Depriest's case was also eager to resolve everything quickly, but the investigation dragged on for 2 weeks since the police had no leads. Finally, the Pizza Hut where Nancy worked reopened to customers. The management implemented security measures, hoping to prevent other possible attacks. A guard was stationed at the restaurant's entrance to monitor all suspicious guests, both inside and outside, and report each one to the police. The detectives hoped the criminal would eventually return to the crime scene, as often happens, and one day they got lucky. On November 9th, the guard was at his post when he overheard a conversation between 2 visitors mentioning Nancy Depriest's name. He slowly turned his head and carefully scanned the room, noticing 2 young men sitting at one of the tables. They were drinking beer and discussing the crime that had occurred at the pizzeria. Then one of the young men stood up and approached the guard to ask about the details of Nancy's death. He introduced himself as Richard and started asking a slew of questions about the murder of the Pizza Hut employee. When the guard asked why he was so interested in the young woman's murder, Richard explained that he was also a manager, just at a different restaurant. At the time of the attack on Nancy, he was also working the morning shift, preparing to open a pizzeria at another location. Apparently, Richard realized the guard wouldn't tell him anything, so both young men left the restaurant without even finishing their beers. The whole situation seemed quite strange, so the guard passed the information to the manager, who, in turn, called the police and reported the odd visitors. The detective leading the Depriest case was intrigued by these 2 guys. The main reason was that Pizza Hut managers and shift supervisors like Nancy had a universal key to access all restaurants in the chain. This meant key holders could enter any pizzeria in Austin. The police quickly identified the employees who showed an unusual interest in Nancy's murder. They were 18-year-old Richard Danziger and his friend, 22-year-old Christopher Ochoa. Richard was indeed a manager, and Chris worked as a cook at Pizza Hut. Undoubtedly, both knew the layout of the chain's restaurants, and Richard had a key. The young men were brought to the police station for questioning. When Richard was asked what he knew about the murder of Nancy Depriest, the guy honestly said he had heard about the blue apron used to clog the men's restroom sink to flood the evidence, and then mentioned that someone had supposedly said Nancy was shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol. The detectives immediately felt that Richard and Chris were somehow involved in the attack on the pizzeria. The guys knew information that wasn't covered in the media. So where could they have learned about the weapon's caliber and the apron's color? That was the question the detectives posed to Richard Danziger. The young man couldn't immediately recall who he had heard these details from, then named another employee. However, as the police later found out, none of Richard's colleagues had said anything like that. This information could only have been known to someone at the crime scene. Richard denied any involvement in the girl's death. Another suspicious detail was that on the morning Nancy was killed, Danziger was late for work. He showed up just after 10. His reason for being late was the most common one. The night before, Richard had been drinking with his girlfriend and a friend, and he overslept. This alibi wasn't exactly reliable. After all, his girlfriend and friend could have conspired with Danziger and lied. Since there was no direct evidence against Richard, he was released. Then Chris Ochoa was called in for questioning. The guy was very surprised that their interest in the crime at the pizzeria, where they worked with Danziger, had provoked such a police reaction. The attack on Nancy was the talk of the town, yet questions were only being asked of them. At that moment, Chris didn't yet realize that fate had pitted him against Sergeant Hector Polanco, the lead detective on the Depriest case, who was ready to do anything to catch the criminal. This policeman had a reputation for closing his cases quickly and dirtily, not caring if he was wrong in some instances. The leadership demanded higher clearance rates, and how Polanco achieved them didn't matter. The sergeant immediately sensed that, unlike Richard, Chris could be pressured. If the guys were guilty of something, he would crack quickly. So when Ochoa started telling the same story Danziger had just shared, Detective Polanco lost his temper. He jumped up from his seat and started yelling at the detainee. The sergeant pounded his fist on the table and painted a picture of the grim future awaiting Chris, talking about the death penalty facing criminals. The worst part was that the sergeant wasn't playing good cop, bad cop. Polanco was genuinely a bad cop, and he terrified the young man. The detective showed Chris a photo of the death row chamber, promising he'd never again have the chance to hug his family. Then he showed a photo from Nancy's autopsy to shock the guy even more. When Ochoa still didn't confess, the sergeant changed tactics. Polanco began pressing that the murder was orchestrated by his friend Richard, who was in the next room trying to pin the blame on Chris to save himself. The detective described what Chris's life in prison would be like, how he'd be fresh meat for the other inmates and would bear responsibility for his friend if he didn't tell how Danziger killed Nancy Depriest. Chris continued to insist he knew nothing, but a 20-hour interrogation and the refusal to provide a lawyer took their toll. The young man was exhausted both mentally and physically. His only desire was to go home and forget it all like a bad dream. That's when he began to break. Chris Ochoa changed his story and was ready to make a statement. The young man confessed that he and Richard had attacked Nancy with the intent to rob. After taking the money from the safe, they decided to have some fun and satisfy their male desires. According to Chris, Danziger was the mastermind, and Ochoa detailed what they did to the girl. Then, realizing she would turn them into the police, they simply shot her. That was exactly the information the detective wanted to hear. Eventually, they took DNA samples from Christopher for analysis, though in the 80s this didn't yield much. They also put the guy on a polygraph, and he failed the test, though a lie detector test didn't guarantee 100% accuracy either. For the police, this was another piece of evidence to add to the confession. On November 14, 1988, Christopher Ochoa was officially charged with the murder of Nancy Depriest. His accomplice, Richard Danziger, was arrested the next day. Now it remained to find evidence linking the young men to Nancy's death. Detective Polanco himself was 99% sure he had caught the criminals. Nancy's family also breathed a sigh of relief, as justice had caught up with the killers with astonishing speed. But coming to terms with the death of their 20-year-old daughter and wife was no easy task. Janet, Nancy's mother, couldn't even imagine what her girl had gone through. It was hard for her to hear the details of the horrific tragedy that had befallen Nancy. The woman sank into a deep depression, showing signs of self-harm. Janet smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day. She lost over 13 kilograms. It's unknown how it might have ended if the older sister of the deceased hadn't convinced the grief-stricken mother to channel her anger and hatred over Nancy's death, not toward herself, but toward those who took her daughter's life. Nancy's death also left a huge void in Todd Depriest's soul. He couldn't comprehend that his young wife would never come home again, that their daughter Sylvia would have to grow up without a mother, that his soul remained with Nancy. Meanwhile, the two Pizza Hut employees accused of attacking Depriest and robbing the restaurant's cash register were in a detention center awaiting trial. Even the lawyer hired by Chris's relatives didn't believe the young man had been coerced into confessing to a crime he supposedly didn't commit. The defense attorney saw the forensic results, which partially matched Ochoa's blood samples and Danziger's hair. The lawyer explained to his client that, given the brutality of the attack, Chris's confession and the DNA results, both faced the death penalty, and the only way to avoid it was to plead guilty. Christopher Ochoa, despite the inconclusive DNA comparison results, fully admitted his guilt. Moreover, he testified against his friend and alleged accomplice, Richard Danziger. Under the terms of a plea deal for the murder of Nancy Depriest, the young man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Danziger, unlike Chris, had no intention of confessing to something he supposedly didn't do, so he faced a full trial. Richard's trial began on January 22, 1990. As evidence, the prosecution team used the hair found at the crime scene and traces of semen. DNA comparison technology in those years was far from modern, but the analysis established a partial match. Chris Ochoa, now in the courtroom, recounted a horrifying story of what they did to Nancy. The guy methodically listed how and with what they tied her up, who attacked first, what the girl said, and so on. The moment Janet, Nancy's mother, heard that her daughter had begged for her life, she felt physically ill. When she left the courtroom, she was sick to her stomach over what those vile people had done to her girl. The image of Nancy pleading to be spared, worrying about little Sylvia, only to receive a bullet to the back of the head after all the assaults, haunted her. What infuriated Janet most was that Richard stared her straight in the eyes the whole time, as if he didn't consider himself guilty. Given Ochoa's testimony and the evidence from the crime scene, Danziger was also found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Nancy's parents, Janet and Eddie, felt complete relief that, 15 months after their beloved daughter's death, they could sleep soundly. The guilty would now be forced to pay for their crimes for the rest of their lives. But in reality, things were not at all as many had imagined. The time the two young men spent behind bars was horrific, but it was better than losing their lives in the prime of youth. For years, Ochoa repeatedly confessed to other inmates that he and his friend Richard Danziger had sent an innocent young woman to her death. Since Janet buried her daughter, she was haunted by the same nightmare. Nancy in the Pizza Hut in Austin, stripped naked in the restroom, kneeling on the cold, dirty floor while someone invisible pushes her. Sobbing, Nancy begs for mercy, but her pleas go unanswered and she cries, "Mom, help me." Then there's a pause, brief as it is, followed by a gunshot, loud enough to jolt Janet out of the nightmare. All the mother's thoughts revolved around one thing. If only she had been there when Nancy was little. If only she had stopped her daughter from marrying so young. If only she had been a good mother. Her girl would be alive now, graduating college. It seemed nothing could dispel these nightmares. Not the life sentences of the two criminals for Nancy's murder. Not the therapy sessions she agreed to. Not the antidepressants prescribed by the doctor. Even time, the best healer, didn't help her. Janet continued to blame herself for not spending enough time with her children when they were young. On October 24, 2000, the 12th anniversary of her daughter's death, Janet, as usual, prayed for Nancy, standing before a striking color portrait of her daughter, which hung like a shrine in the hallway of her modest home. The phone rang just after 7 a.m. It was her son-in-law who told her to urgently turn on the TV. Janet stood in front of the screen, unable to grasp the meaning of the words. Would she have to go through all this again? She couldn't take it anymore. The woman covered her face with her hands and silently wept, as there were hardly any tears left after all these years. While Chris Ochoa and Richard Danziger were serving life sentences for the attack on the Pizza Hut manager, another inmate in a Texas prison, named Achim Joseph Marino, was writing and sending letters to various institutions. After a religious awakening in 1996, Marino wanted to atone for his sins. He contacted the Austin police, the local newspaper, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the then Texas governor, George Bush, but none of them took his message seriously. Marino was serving 3 life sentences for serious crimes, but he was guilty of 1 more death, for which others had been convicted. And now, Joseph was tormented by guilt. The convicted Marino provided the Austin police with information that directly led investigators to the discovery of restaurant keys, handcuffs, a .22 caliber pistol he used in the attack, and 2 bags of money he took from the restaurant. But instead of investigating, the police simply ignored Marino's words and evidence. The authorities didn't conduct a DNA analysis to link the evidence to the crime. They didn't perform a ballistics test to match the shell casings found at the scene with Joseph's gun. They already had 2 inmates serving time for the murder of Nancy Depriest, and the evidence against them seemed convincing enough. Why stir up the past again? Only in 2000, under pressure from the Innocence Project, represented by a group of law students from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, did Texas authorities finally investigate Marino's gun and the male DNA from Nancy Depriest's body. The evidence matched perfectly, and a re-examination completely ruled out Chris Ochoa and Richard Danziger as the perpetrators of the murder of the Pizza Hut manager. After 12 years, Christopher Ochoa was released from prison. All charges against him were dropped, and he was awarded over $5 million in compensation for his wrongful conviction. Chris's false confession, made under police pressure, not only affected his fate, but also completely ruined Richard Danziger's life. While in prison, Richard was attacked by another inmate, Armando Gutierrez. Gutierrez knocked Danziger to the ground and struck him multiple times on the head with a sharp-toed boot. The blows caused part of the man's skull to penetrate his brain. The injured man was taken to a nearby hospital, where part of his brain was removed during emergency surgery. Due to the injuries, Richard suffered from partial paralysis, seizures, anxiety, and mental disorders. Danziger often couldn't hold a simple conversation or recognize family members. Eventually, he was transferred to a psychiatric prison in Kirbyville, where he was to remain for the rest of his days. After that incident, Richard suffered irreversible brain damage, became disabled, and required lifelong care. Richard Danziger was also released from prison. He received $9 million in compensation for moral damages. But that money couldn't restore the health of a young man full of strength and hope for the future, who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. On the 12th anniversary of her daughter's death, Janet, Nancy's mother, heard on the TV that Chris Ochoa and Richard Danziger, the monsters who took her daughter's life, were about to be released. For all those years, she believed those 2 guys had assaulted and then shot Nancy. Janet had attended Danziger's trial, listening as the prosecution's main witness, Chris Ochoa, described the crime's details in horrifying detail. Could it all have been a lie and a terrible miscarriage of justice? At the trial, Achim Joseph Marino testified that on the morning of October 24, 1988, posing as a vending machine repairman, he tricked his way into the restaurant where Nancy Depriest was. When the young woman opened the door for the repairman, she unknowingly signed her own death warrant. Achim was a man who had heard voices in his head since childhood, and that day he felt compelled to sacrifice someone. He didn't understand why, but he was certain he was doing the right thing. Later, a psychiatrist evaluating the defendant concluded that the man had difficulty distinguishing right from wrong and had mental health issues. Inside the restaurant, Marino, threatening with a gun, took money from the safe, tied the girl's hands with her own bra, and decided to have his way with her. When he was done, he stepped away from his victim, pulled out the gun, and shot Nancy in the head. She didn't even have time to say anything, as she didn't expect it to end like that. Then the man wiped fingerprints off the counters and frantically searched for the spent .22 caliber shell casing that had ejected from his gun. Unable to find it, he hurried to escape. When the full truth about the crime committed by Marino came to light, Janet realized that Ochoa and Danziger were innocent. Her heart filled with compassion for the mothers of the two young men. Now, instead of anger and hatred toward them, she felt sympathy, as Chris and Richard's parents had lost their children for 12 years. There was no doubt that Ochoa and Danziger had been framed by the police. The case against them was fabricated. Detective Polanco immediately realized it would be hard to make Richard confess to something he didn't do. But the soft and timid Chris, who unquestioningly believed in the power of authority, broke after being threatened with violence. He confessed to a crime he didn't commit and implicated his friend. Polanco, unfortunately, wasn't the only Austin policeman who behaved abusively toward suspects. In 1992, an investigative team found that excessive workload, inadequate training, and lack of proper oversight repeatedly led to false confessions. The team also noted that Austin police detectives often withheld information that was inconvenient for their investigations. Even when the Austin police received Joseph Marino's confession letter and found undeniable evidence at his mother's house, the detectives tried to tie all three men together, despite Marino's initial statement that he acted alone and had no accomplices. The investigators refused to admit their mistakes until the very end. It's unknown how it might have ended if the Innocence Project hadn't taken up Ochoa's case. Christopher later admitted he was close to taking his own life just to avoid bearing the burden of responsibility for a crime he didn't actually commit. Nancy Depriest's mother, Janet, went to the prison and spoke with Marino to learn the details of her daughter's death. She was comforted by the fact that Nancy didn't even have time to grasp the full tragedy. The woman opposed the death penalty for Joseph Marino, believing the criminal should spend the rest of his life answering for the consequences of his actions. Marino's trial took place in October 2002, and he received another life sentence. Christopher Ochoa graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School and now works as a lawyer. Richard Danziger died in 2021. Nancy's mother, Janet, passed away in 2019 at the age of 69. In her final years, the woman battled lung cancer. Todd Depriest, Sylvia, and the rest of the family were left with memories of Nancy, a hard-working, devoted, sweet, cheerful, and vibrant young woman, as she was in life. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.